Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the opportunity to chair this panel on global perspectives on the threat of the increasing power and manifestation of authoritarian regimes in Russia and China. My name is Jan Breivoll. I'm a board member of the Norwegian Hong Kong Committee and also some other places. I'll try to stay out of the discussion as much as possible unless I feel the need to bring it back on track. To introduce our panelists, we have with us from Taiwan, Julia Marinaccio. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bergen, specializing in comparative politics on China and Taiwan. I believe that's correct. If I introduce someone wrong, please just correct me. We also have with us Ola Elvestuen from the Norwegian Liberal Party, where he has a long history of engagement in human rights in Parliament. We have Petter Eide, formerly a Norwegian Parliament member, former General Secretary of Norwegian Amnesty and the Norwegian People's Aid. So a very solid panel. We also have with us Jan Arild Snoen, who's a writer and prolific commentator in Norwegian newspapers and magazines, who has recently published a book on the new Cold War, the United States versus China, which is available outside afterwards if anyone would like to take a look at it. So I thought I'd start with a short sort of introduction to the subject by each panel member. And I thought we'd start with you, Julia. Please bring us some information on what we need to know about what it's like in Taiwan now.
Hello, can you hear me all? I think we have, maybe I'm a little bit late, I don't know. Anyway, so because I'm watching YouTube while I'm talking here. So yeah, right now I'm in Taiwan after 3 years after COVID did not let us travel to we couldn't travel under COVID, neither to China nor to Taiwan. And Taiwan opened recently for researchers and tourists, and now you can enter Taiwan without any visas, without any restrictions, even like you don't need to go into quarantine, which is quite the opposite of what is going on and what is happening in China, which is ever much more closing, and we don't know when it will be possible for us to go back to China. So right now we're in the run-up of the local elections, the so-called 9-in-1 elections. These are very huge elections in terms of the amount, like the number of people that are voted into a political office. From the very, very local level, like on the district level or in the neighborhood level, to the municipality, the mayors, and we're going like we still have 2 weeks to go, and the election campaigns are all over the place. Although, after having talked to some people who were here like 4 years ago during the other local elections, they said that the election campaigns were far more intensive 4 years ago than today. We don't know really what the reasons are. Some people think that maybe people are tired of election campaigning or like participating in election campaigning. I think maybe, like personally, maybe it's because of everything that's going on right now in the world, and also with still like some restrictions, like after 3 years of COVID and all the restrictions that people had to bear with. So maybe the enthusiasm to cheer and rally is like maybe lower than it was, like for these reasons is lower than it was 4 years ago. So the elections are local elections. So what the topic that that Taiwan is discussing, or the Taiwanese public is discussing right now, are less China than local politics. So issues, for example, in Taipei, when it comes to traffic, when it comes to construction sites, or the building of huge infrastructure building with a lot of maybe wrong or not so good investment decisions in between. So it's much more about local politics than it would be than it is about cross-strait relations, so relationships between China and Taiwan. But nevertheless, obviously, China is always present in the media and also in discussions. It's just so it's much less now discussed in the run-up to the local elections than it was discussed like in the run-up of the 20th Party Congress. So yes, so that's the current, I would say the current climate here in Taiwan. I don't know. I mean, I can talk later then a little bit more when it comes to like changes in cross-strait policies, or what might be what kind of new stances or not so new stances might influence Taiwan's perspective in the next years. But for the time being, I would leave it like that, saying that, yeah, China is always present, but for local elections, it's definitely not the biggest issue, although it will come back, definitely will come back to be a big issue after the elections. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll just continue straight forward with Mr. Elvestuen.
Thank you. First, if we look at the international situation, I think that the 24th of February changes everything with the Russian attack on Ukraine. And it's not the attack that is surprising, it's more that there's two things. One, that Ukraine stood up and that they fight back, and they're so effective at doing it. And the other thing is that the rest of the world, or at least Europe, North America, and also our partners in Asia, as Australia, South Korea, Japan, stood up for Ukraine. And that we are now entering a world with more or less, we will have a more divided world, depending on how much China will lean on to Russia. And they will lean on to Russia. And that makes a challenge towards all of us. And of course, this relates also to the situation for Taiwan, because Taiwan, just as it's not a dilemma, because it's easy what they need to do, but it's still a dilemma, because just like Ukraine, by becoming or starting to become a successful democracy, they became an intolerable threat to Putin. And for Taiwan, what is not a dilemma, but I will call it as, because you don't find another word, is that they need to have as a successful democracy as possible. And they are in Freedom House, now they are on the 3rd or 4th, I think. It's really high up. So everything is working well, because they need that to get the international support and to have an international preparedness for supporting Taiwan. At the same time, by being a successful democracy, they are a threat to the Chinese government. Because what Taiwan is showing is what the rest of the world never talked about earlier, but might start to do, is that they show that China can be a free and democratic country. There's no reason for that not being a possibility, as long as you have Taiwan functioning as incredibly well as it does. And that is also the international relevance of local elections and other elections, is that they're there and they're working, they have legitimacy, they're taking care of the local issues, but that also is what is fundamentally a threat. And it's the same here, that no doubt the US is putting more emphasis on China. That means that the rest of us have to support that, but we also have to take a larger responsibility in Europe on the issues and in areas where the US then cannot be present. So this that means that the cooperation with not only the European Union has to take more responsibility, whether it's the Middle East, it's in Africa, other places. You have the NATO alliance is important also when it's related to the NATO plus countries, to put it that way. Whether it's India, it's Japan, South Korea, Australia. And all of this has to be built up, because there's no doubt that if it's not a confrontation, it is definitely it's definitely that we have an opponent in China that we have to take seriously. And now I talk about the security issues, but as I mentioned also earlier, no international organization is small enough for the Chinese not to try to be dominant in it. And they work very well on it. They build up their connections, and they, of course, they use all the corrupt and every method to do it. The ones that we cannot do, because we have to build on a value system. But as countries, and as we have to be way more organized and strategic in the way we operate with also international organizations, so that they do not, so they will not be able to keep the position that they already have gotten. That is also the way. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Eide, if you would continue, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Jan, and thanks to Ola also. My name is Petter Eide, and I was introduced as the former Member of Parliament representing Socialist Left Party, and also former head of Amnesty and Norwegian People's Aid. But it's important for me to say right now that I'm not here representing none of them. Regarding Socialist Left Party, I would say even rather the opposite, I would say, because I am very disappointed on my former party, because I think on the China discussion they are very, very passive, very, very passive. So we might discuss that a little bit later. I would like to share with you, so I'm actually here just on behalf of myself and to share my reflections on these issues. Three things I'd like to talk about. Just some short overview of the development of authoritarian states. Secondly, also to look how the world has been responding to them, and see what there are some small changes actually lately that we might we could look into. And thirdly, what should be the Norwegian response to development of authoritarian states. I think the last thing is important for also to discuss. Okay, I think we all are very concerned about the last decade's development of authoritarian state. We are talking about countries like China, Russia, India, Brazil, Philippines, US, also under Trump, in Europe, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Turkey. Yes, we need to add Italy also after the last election. I think we need to do that. The concern about these states are, of course, that these states, these kind of authoritarian regimes, they are less willing to international cooperation if it doesn't benefit themselves. They are undermining international democracy, the international law and order. They do not care about international commitments regarding for instance, human rights. And so, the trend we have seen since the 19th with building up international commitments and regulations to secure peace and stability throughout the world, the development of authoritarian regimes is actually a threat to that movement. At the same time, we need to look at, there have been some signs the last kind of year that perhaps stupid to say that, democracies has struck back in a way. We see the latest election in the US. I'm sure Jan Arild here will talk more about that, and to look at that we saw that the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again movement to Trump, did not win. It was actually weakened, which is very interesting. We have seen the election in Brazil, where Lula won, which is a very interesting sign. But I think perhaps one of the most important and positive things is that is to look into the European response to the Russia-Ukrainian war. So look how the European leaders have been responding to that. They have tried to transform that war from being a war between Russia and Ukraine, transform that war to kind of a proxy war between democracy and dictatorship. And that kind of a transformation is very interesting, because doing so, they can easily support that we need to defend Ukraine, because Ukraine symbolically represents the democratic side, and we can also then be in opposition to Russia. But the signal is important also internally in Europe, because it's also taking that kind of proxy transformation into a war between dictatorship and democracies. They can also communicate a support to democracies within their own countries, and they can use the the importance of strengthening the democratic values in those countries. So even if there have for the last decades been a development of authoritarian states, we have also seen that there have been some changes and some response to that, which we might interpret and look into as a little bit positive, I think. So what should be the Norwegian response to development of authoritarian state? When I was in the parliament, Ola remember that because we are on the same side here, and also before that, there are two basic responses from I think from Norway to authoritarian states. Response number one is to never be dependent on them, which is kind of response number one. You should never be dependent on an authoritarian state, because that will bring you in a lot of trouble. Because that state will then try to use their values, and they can even use their different kind of methods to make some damage in your own country. We have seen now the problem with that a lot of European countries have been dependent on Russia, on gas. So we see the trouble when you are becoming dependent on authoritarian state, what kind of trouble that brings you in. Regarding China, Norway should, of course, never be dependent on China. Therefore, I've also said, as a member of parliament, Norway should try to quit the normalization agreement, because that brings us into trouble, and Norway should never sign a free trade agreement on China, because that will bring us into a dependency on China, which is not very good. That will bring us into kind of dependency on Chinese technology, which will be very, very damaging for Norway. So I think I think I can stop there, actually, because the key response to authoritarian state is point number one: never be dependent on them, and secondly, I will come into that, always maintain the values of human rights and international order as key principles when in bilateral meetings with these states. With bilateral meetings with authoritarian states, Norway should say that, well, our focus number one is, of course, human rights, democracy, and the importance of international law and order, not the trade and financial agreement with you. So there might be situations when Norway will lose economically on that kind of insisting of human rights and international law and order. But of course, that should be the price we have to pay. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Snoen, if you will be the last one out here.
Yes, I will focus on the threat to Taiwan in light of some developments the last year. First, there's no doubt that China's goal is to invade and conquer Taiwan. A peaceful reunion is it's now more or less off the table after what's happened in Hong Kong. There's no constituency in Taiwan for that anymore. So therefore, the only way for China to reunite, as they called it themselves, with Taiwan is by force. And although no timetable has publicly been declared, there's a common understanding that this goal should be achieved within the centennial of the Communist Party takeover of mainland China. That is 2049. That's a long way from now, but an alternative timetable is the centennial of the People's Liberation Army, which is in 2027. That's 5 years from now. And the exact timing of this will be decided by the Communist Party leadership, which for many years to come will be Xi Jinping himself. And this will be based on his evaluation of the strength of his army and what he thinks the rest of the world will do. So 3 recent developments have influence on this decision. The first is that Xi Jinping now has, through the last party congress, strengthened his position. He has purged all moderates from the leadership. So the standing committee of the Politburo can now easily be transferred into a war cabinet. The second thing is that Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan and several statements from President Biden has clarified the US commitment to the defense of Taiwan. But maybe Xi Jinping hopes that Trump will come back in 2024 and introduce new uncertainty to this. We don't know what, well, Trump has not been a friend of China. He's fascinated by dictators, but has not been a friend of China, so we don't know. But she might hope that this will improve his position, just as Putin thought that a Republican win this week in US would improve his position, which it did not. So the third thing is that the Taiwan war has, on the one hand, opened up a window for Chinese aggression because the West is preoccupied with this war, and much of the quite a number of arms from the EU and from the US has been transferred to the Ukraine. But more importantly, on the other hand, it has shown that although what we thought was a superior force, it cannot easily conquer a smaller nation as long as that nation is opposed and together and supported by the West, as Elvestuen was mentioning. So it was also a test of whether the West will support a minor nation under attack. So this should dissuade Xi from attacking. And the most important thing for Xi Jinping is to preserve his own power and the power of the Communist Party. So he will not do anything if he thinks the risk is too big. And what he's seeing now, well, the Putin regime seems to be at the moment rather stable, but this can change very, very fast. And if the Ukraine war leads to the downfall of Putin, that will be really a shock for Xi Jinping. And he will be afraid of that the same thing can happen to him. He has said this a few years ago, that if we try to take Taiwan and don't succeed, the regime, the Communist Party, will fall. This is a wake-up call for him, that the war has been so badly managed by the Russians. So, in conclusion, or to conclude here, the long-term development of China will also play an important role. There are 2 schools of thought on this. On the one hand, some people, and I sometimes are close to them, think that China's global power will peak around 2030, because the economic growth is now slowing down. The population is falling. From this year or next year, the population in China will fall. And for 10 years now, the labor force in China has been falling in absolute numbers. So this is the one scenario where they peak. And the other scenario is that although Chinese growth will slow down, China will continue to rise for a long time. And China experts disagree about these two schools. But those who believe in the first, this peaking around 2030, they think that this will be the most dangerous period for the world, because Xi Jinping will be, maybe he will try to achieve his goal as long as he is on the peak of his power. If we wait for too long, it will be more difficult. So, my personal view of this is that Xi Jinping will not risk his power, the Communist Party's power, in the coming years, and that he will continue to play the long game. And that means that this goal will not be achieved in his lifetime. But 2049 is a long time, and they have patience, and they have used to be patient, the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought to sort of begin this discussion part here, I have a personal worry on this issue and on the comparison with Ukraine, because what do you here think, how much do you think it matters that while Ukraine was internationally recognized nation state, Taiwan is not. It's officially a territory, not a state. Does that matter, or can that hurt the Western response to Chinese aggression against Taiwan? Yes, Janari.
I don't think it matters much. The importance of Taiwan is that if Taiwan is allowed to fall, all the countries in the region, they will stop believing in American security guarantees, and everything will fall with them. So Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea, even Japan will then reorientate themselves towards China. And most American security experts believe in this, and also the establishment in the parties in the US. The non-establishment, like Trump and so on, can do other things, but I think the importance of Taiwan is not dependent on whether they are recognized as independent or not.
Ola, you had a short comment.
Well, I just think that that is up to us and the rest of the world in a way. That we have to act on towards Taiwan and make sure that it doesn't matter. So that's also one reason that we also should look at how we cooperate with Taiwan. That we also look at how do we normalize this relationship as we can, as much as we can, because it's in the broad strategic picture. Of course, it's the U.S. position in the world, but on the other side, on the other hand, we are all also part of this, so that we also have to make sure that we build on to that position, and because I think you're very right that for Xi Jinping in the end will be an evaluation if it's an attack is beneficial for him or if the risk is too high. So for us, it's also that the normalized situation is also a way of showing that the risk will be too high.
Petru?
I can also
and Julia, I can actually see you, so when you want to take the word, you can just raise your hand.
I thought you were asking the round, so I waited until.
Oh yes, you can.
Yeah.
I will give the word to you after Petter. Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree with Jan Arild and Ola here. I don't think the formalization of Taiwan as a sovereign state doesn't really matter because regarding from the outside world, they are de facto an independent state and will be regarded as that. But the question here, I would like to ask Jan Arild about that actually. Should that be a statement actually from the Norwegian government? Should they kind of communicate something like that? Or can we look into because I believe that Norway is very passive in saying or meaning anything about the China-Taiwan conflict. Do you think that passiveness is regarded also, of course it might have something to do with that they are at the same time doing negotiations on a free trade agreement and they are extremely careful. But could there also be some kind of formal reasons like this formalization of Taiwan as a state, or lack of formalization as a state?
Well, I would play the role of the cynic here now. I really don't think that matters. I think that what matters regarding Taiwan is the United States, and the United States, and then the United States, and maybe the EU. Norway should, I think, we should confront China on many issues, but I think we should more focus on things like Hong Kong, perhaps, and the Uyghurs, especially. Well, it wouldn't hurt if Norway had a clear view on this, but it wouldn't help much either, because this is far too big for Norway. We think of ourselves as a global superpower in diplomacy and so on. We are not. Sometimes we can play a role because we can spend money on things, but otherwise we are not as important as we think.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, I also agree that I think formal sovereignty or formal recognition does not matter when it comes to a war. If China invaded Taiwan. But one thing is clear, that Taiwan is much more important for the US, historically, but also geopolitically speaking, and Taiwan is much less important to the EU or to Europe. So while we now with the and this has something to do with the distance and with maybe not our not so big geopolitical interests as compared to the US. In that region, in the Pacific region. And this is something that the Chinese central government, I think, is aware of. So while the European Union was quite united in the question of how to deal with the Russian invasion in Ukraine and to immediately, without further questioning, support the Ukraine in defending itself against its aggressions, I doubt that this would be the case if there was a war in Taiwan, because China invades. The other thing is, although the US has geopolitical interests, it's still not clear. So I disagree that it really clarified its position on whether it would intervene into a war or not. And because the US did not intervene in sending troops into Ukraine, so why should it do that then in Taiwan, for example? And this is also something I think that that is a question that the Chinese government, central government, is still pondering on. There is still an ambiguity and the risk that it cannot that it cannot calculate, or that's not a risk that's there. Let's say it like this. Yeah, that's one thing. The other thing, when it comes to whether there will be a war or not, with all the deadlines, yes, the Chinese government, central government, has never given a deadline. 27 with the PLAs in like centenary. It's many experts say it's too early, so the PLA would not be ready at this point to actually to wage a war against Taiwan without losing it then. It would support the statement by Xi Jinping that he made in 2013 and 2019 that the Taiwan question must not be delayed to the next generation, because but delaying like not invading in 5 years or in 10 years, 2035, which would be basically the end of Xi Jinping, the maximum end of Xi Jinping, would in fact delay the question, the Taiwan question, to the next generation. So it's really guesswork, and we really don't know. But a lot of like how high the possibilities, like the pragmatic possibilities, in terms of that there is a strategy to invade Taiwan at a certain point. We don't know that, and maybe there is not such a strategy. But the greatest risk that we face now is that we have a very powerful leader in China who has surrounded himself by loyalists similar to Putin, and who might not, and all the moderates, kicked out all the moderates of the his circles, of the inner circles. So the unpredictability of a leader who has built around himself a personality cult, who's even feared to back down on a zero COVID policy that obviously not works, because he fears of losing his legitimacy or losing his face. We don't know. So I think the real danger is not the deadline, the strategic deadline. The real deadline is the predictability of the current leader, Xi Jinping.
Thank you very much. I want to bring up something that came up in what Petter said, that an important response that can be done in Norway is to reduce our dependency on authoritarian regimes. Because one thing that at least surprised me this spring was that there seemed to be no course adjustment from political parties or the major organizations in Norway, like the labor organizations or the major business organizations, on that issue. So the course seems to me to be the same on China as it was on Russia after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, or the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, where there wasn't really an adjustment in politics on how to relate to Russia. And that perhaps the current war in Ukraine should have brought about a course adjustment like that on how we relate to China. If you're comfortable just doing a round from left to right, that seemed to work well, so I think we'll just continue to do that.
Well, Norway is not as dependent on these countries as some of the countries in the European Union are. So even though we had this shameful agreement in 2016 to sell more fish and so on, it was not really a very central thing for a Norwegian economy. We shouldn't have done that, and I agree we should not negotiate or continue to negotiate a free trade agreement. I don't think we should stop trading with China, but we should be more concerned about security issues. So it was good that Huawei didn't get into Norway and things like that. But let me just briefly, because I want to say that about Germany. Germany is doing the same mistake again. Angela Merkel did a mistake with Russia, and now Scholz going to Beijing doing the same mistake. because they want to sell Mercedes. And this also creates problems within the EU, because the French were not very happy about that trip, because they wanted to try to stand together against the Germans. This is not your question, because you talked about Norway, but Norway is a small player in this, and we should reduce our dependence, as Petter Eide said. But we are really not that dependent on China, not like Germany was on Russians. But we should have that in the back of our minds, and especially on the technology front.
Yeah. Then I will say the same as I said earlier. Norway is not a small country. Norway is a country. And we have to stop thinking of ourselves as a small country. We have to use the positions that we have. And one thing of this is, where we have also a position, is of course to work so that Europe sticks together. Because I totally agree that the Scholz is way too early trip to Beijing now is giving the completely wrong signal that is possible to give. And for us, I also agree on this. We have to this agreement back in 2016 for us also to understand what have we done. To me, that is just it is in Chinese history, it's a traditional kowtow. That means you go to the emperor, accepting that we have made a mistake, and onto his respect, we bend over as deep as we can, in shame, as deep so that our forehead touches the ground. And it's not, and that's what Norway have done. And then it's not that they accepting it. No, then we can move on. And it's really is the most shameful thing that we've done. So now we have to stand up and start to act as a country again. The free trade agreement, of course, should not be there. Just like it was a mistake to let China into the WTO in its time. Also, it shouldn't be there because they do not follow the rules anyway, even though we have an agreement. But we should bring it on. I think also we have to question the free trade agreement with Hong Kong. There also, there is a position there that they have the responsibility to uphold the freedoms of the people in Hong Kong. That is definitely broken. So we need to bring that up within EFTA. Where we have that agreement on. Also, because I think that is a good signal to the world that someone started to question what does it economically mean, the way they've taken over Hong Kong. So that is something that we should bring on. And then thirdly, we have to be more bold and standing up and talk the truth. I mean, learn from Lithuania. We are, as you say, we are a country. And we have to talk the truth about the genocide in East Turkestan. You have to talk about the oppression that is everywhere, the silence that we talked about earlier in Tibet, and about the situation in Tibet. So it's like just being truthful in a way. That is a important part of this positioning that we need to take. And then normalization also of the situation in Taiwan, that it's like that China makes it politics just by elected people visit Taiwan. As long as they do that, we should definitely visit Taiwan and be part of this. Just be part of that normalization that we have. And as you said, the U.S., there's a huge strategic positioning, and there's no doubt that the U.S. needs to focus more on Asia. That means also that we cannot be important there, but then we, as the rest of Europe, has to take more responsibility in the areas around us, and that is also part of that global strategy that we are a part of.
No, that was very good, Ola. Perhaps I should vote Venstre. No.
No, just one thing before I forget it, because I mentioned I was a Minister of Climate and Environment, but the last meeting I had before I became minister, that was the meeting we had with the president of Tibet, and we were the only one that met.
Well,
I should probably say that we're
dream.
running
That
out
was a dream
of
for
time
you.
here a
Should
little,
vote
so
Venstre, But that was very good anyway. So we are on the same page here. We totally agree, so I should not repeat what they said, but just we can reflect on that. Perhaps the dependency that we have seen that several European states have been on Russian gas, that dependency should be some kind of warning. Should be some kind of warning, not be dependent on China. So perhaps they, I mean, they have been negotiated on the free trade agreement now for many years, 10 years something. And so perhaps even that negotiation is taking some kind of slow. I mean, they are looking at the development in the world to finalize that agreement. And I believe also they are using the Russia-Ukraine development also as input to how they should deal with that agreement. That kind of dependency with authoritarian states is not only about business and trade. It might also be about security and defense. When Trump was elected as a president in the US, I was public saying that Norway should be more independent from US because the US is now turning to be a dictatorship with Trump. How can Norway be in a defense alliance with a dictatorship like US, and which is dominating? So there is also a reflection we should take. I am becoming more and more positive to NATO. I need to say that. But there should be some kind of reflections also that in a very kind of a fragile and unpredictable US, there need also to be some kind of reflection whether we should be more independent on US regarding defense. Just to add that. When we are discussing dependencies on authoritarian states. Thanks.
Thank you. Julia, I don't know if maybe you have something to add.
When it comes to Norway's foreign policies or interaction in general, economic policies, I'm not an expert on that. I'm relatively new in Norway, so I wouldn't want to add any suggestions. But I think that in general that Europe has or European countries have realized that being dependent in terms of resources, in terms of production chains. On one or two countries in the world that happen to be authoritarian states is definitely not a good idea. So yes, I think it is time for us to think ways out of one. Like it is never a one-way dependency because China is also dependent on us, but yes, to diversify also in production chains and in terms of resources for like fossil fuels. I mean, Norway is a little bit specific because Norway has oil and has a high production, still a high production in very high production in renewable energy. So it's much more independent than most other European states. And I think this is definitely a plus or an advantage of Norway to being much less dependent on Russia or on at least like in terms of resources. When it comes to issues like I don't know, what is the production of pharmaceutical products? I don't know. I didn't follow that discussion, but that was a huge issue at the beginning of COVID. That a lot of that everything was produced in one or two countries, namely in India and China. And if those countries are closed, then we do not get the basics for actually making our pharmaceutical products, and this is definitely this was a problem, and this is also something that we should continue discussing and finding ways of out of this dependency. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we don't have time for questions. I can give one final remark to Ola, who's been itching to do
Yes, I think that's because there's one area we haven't mentioned yet, and I think it's important here. That is the role of the pension fund. I mean, we have, I don't know, we are invested in 600 companies or something in China, I think. And I hope, because that is also a risk. If you look at the values that Russia had around the world, it's easy to grab if someone wants it. But it's but there too, I hope we have a leader of the pension fund now that understand that gradually we should have less invested in China. That is one area. And I think also maybe it is a political question, because we get these reports also to Parliament. Should we act on towards the stock exchange in Shanghai the same way now as we have done before? And the same thing is, should we act in the same way on towards the stock exchange in Hong Kong? Because now we treat Hong Kong at exactly the same way as we do with in London or New York. So I think this is it's a much broader discussion for us that must be. I do not know if I have the answer yet, but it must be discussed and be made. It must be made a topic when you see the changes that has happened in China, and that it's not only authoritarian. I mean, this is a totalitarian way. I mean, there's nothing else that has gone that strong in that direction. And you have a country with concentration camps with millions of people in it. That you have a situation where you have forced labor or slavery. That is a more important part of the world economy now, and it hasn't been that way since 1865. So the scale of it is so enormous. So we have to take that also into account, how we put and invest our enormous resources in that respect.
Thank you.